Shalom and welcome to LeRaglai Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. We're continuing in our series in the book of Genesis, and I've titled this teaching with a question: what is the purpose of the seventh day? We'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. And I want to start by explaining that these verses, Genesis 2, 1 to 3, are a part of a weekly tradition in Judaism to welcome the Sabbath, to bless the Sabbath, to sanctify the Sabbath. We do this at Kabbalat Shabbat, the welcoming of the Sabbath. And these verses in Genesis 2, 1 to 3 are read every week as a reminder of that first Sabbath on the seventh day, as we read it in Genesis 2, 1 to 3. Now we do this with a full cup of wine, and this tradition or this practice is called Kiddush, which means sanctification. And so I want to begin this teaching with reading Genesis 2, 1 to 3 in Hebrew. And we read this. ויחולו השמיים והארץ וכל צבאם, ויכל אלוהים ביום השביעי מלאכתו אשר עשה, וישבות ביום השביעי מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה. ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי וקדש אותו, כי בו שבת מכל מלאכתו אשר ברא אלוהים לעשות. This is Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3. Now I want to read the translation in English. And just to note that the translation I'm reading is what I have translated directly from the Hebrew, just as I did in chapter 1. I'm continuing in chapter 2. So you may see a couple of words different from the translation you use, but I'm trying to give the most literal or accurate translation directly from the Hebrew. So we read this in Genesis 2, 1 to 3. And the heavens and the earth were completed, and all of their host. And on the seventh day, God finished the work which he had made. And on the seventh day, God ceased from all of the work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, for on it he ceased from all of his work which God created to make. So as we get into this teaching, I just want to pose a few questions to be thinking about as we go through this teaching, and hopefully to find reasonable answers. So number one, what did God do on the seventh day? Number two, why did God acknowledge the seventh day, since nothing of significance was accomplished on this day? Number three, why did God bless and sanctify the seventh day? Number four, did Adam and Eve need to rest in a perfect world? And number five, what is the purpose of the seventh day? And that's the main question, the title of this teaching that we'll be focusing on and trying to find a good answer to as we go through this teaching. Now let's review Genesis chapter 1 briefly before we get into the text of Genesis 2. In Genesis 1:1, we read this opening statement or explanation of how the universe came into being. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth speak of the universe or the cosmos, all of the created order that God spoke into being and brought forth by his power. God started creating the heavens and the earth in the beginning and continued to create and arrange the details of the universe during the 6 days of creation. Then God finished his work, as we read in Genesis 2:1, quote, and the heavens and the earth were completed, and all of their host. Now, who or what is the host that was completed together with the heavens and the earth? Now, the word host is used for the first time here in Genesis chapter 2. The Hebrew word for host is tzava, and it can mean a company, a host, an army, war, or service. Just like many words in Hebrew, they can have more than one meaning, and it depends on the context and how they are used. So in this verse, it is best translated, the word tzava, as a host, and seems to be used in a very general manner. In this context, the Hebrew phrase, ve'kol tzava'am, and all of their host, is clearly speaking of that which was created in relation to the heavens and the earth. The host could be referring to the planets, stars, galaxies, fish, birds, animals, humans, angels, cherubim, or everything combined. Since there is no more information given, we are limited to what is written in the text. Now, after reading the passive form of the completion of creation in verse 1, and the heavens and the earth were completed, we then read the active manner in which God completed all of his work in verse 2, where we read, "And on the seventh day God finished the work which he had made, and on the seventh day God ceased from all of the work which he had made." After appointing Adam and Eve to rule over his creation on the sixth day, God ceased from his work on the seventh day. The Hebrew of the second part of verse 2 reads as follows: Vayishbot beyom hashevi'i mikol melakto asher asa. And on the seventh day, God ceased from all of the work which he had made. So the Hebrew word for cease is shavat, or the infinitive lishbot, to stop or to cease. It is from this Hebrew verb shavat that we are given the noun form Shabbat in the Bible. When God ceased from his work on the seventh day, it was the polar opposite action of what he did during days 1 through 6 by creating and making everything in the heavens and the earth. The word Shabbat is often used interchangeably for the seventh day in the scriptures. Now, in verse 3, we read how God set apart the seventh day in a unique manner, which we read, "And God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, for on it he ceased from all of his work, which God created to make." So it's interesting to see how these first three verses in Genesis 2 contain a lot of repetition about something quite simple. God finished creating, he stopped his work, and he blessed and marked the seventh day as holy. The Hebrew word for seven, or seventh as it's used here, is shavi, and it appears 3 times in these 3 verses. Why was the seventh day marked as a holy day? According to the scriptures, God did not want his work of creation to be forgotten. Therefore, he set apart the seventh day to be a continual reminder of the magnificent work of his hands and to remind humanity of the origins of life. Our very existence is a direct result of the ongoing story of history as God's created order, which continues from generation to generation. We are all recipients of the creation account. We specifically read how God blessed and sanctified the seventh day in Genesis 2:3. The Hebrew verb to bless is levarech. During the 6 days of creation, we read the Hebrew word levarech 2 other times. On day 5, God blessed the sea creatures and the birds of the air in Genesis 1:22. And on day 6, God blessed the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, in Genesis 1:28. So during the 7 days of creation week, God blessed 3 things. Number 1, God blessed the sea creatures and the birds on day 5. Number 2, God blessed man and woman on day 6. And then God blessed the seventh day, the Sabbath, on day 7. So just to note here that a Jewish tradition up till today is that on the Sabbath, the seventh day, man is to eat fish, thereby incorporating all 3 blessings of God. So you can take that for what it's worth. Now, God not only blessed the seventh day, but he also sanctified it. The Hebrew word used for this sanctifying act in Genesis 2:3 is lekadesh, to sanctify or to make holy. By blessing and sanctifying the seventh day, God instituted the first global holiday, the Sabbath day. So what happened on that first day, the seventh day of creation week? We don't know exactly what happened on that day, as there are no other details given to us about the first Sabbath in the scriptures. God did not create or make anything new on that day, since his work was completed. Adam and Eve were on the earth at that time, and the seventh day of creation would have been their first full day on earth, the first full day in existence. Adam and Eve would have seen their first sunrise on that Sabbath day. The earth was pristine, untouched by sin or any form of destruction on that first Sabbath. All of creation, including the birds, fish, animals, and Adam and Eve, witnessed a Sabbath day like no other, together with the Creator God on that seventh day. What is the purpose of the seventh day? This is the overriding question to this teaching. As recorded on day 4 of creation, the reason that God arranged the sun, moon, and stars in the heavens was to separate between day and night upon the earth, and to let them be for signs and for appointed times and for days and for years, as we read in Genesis 1:14. The most basic measurement of counting days is in a cycle of 7, what we call a week, with the marker being the 7th day, the Sabbath. God illustrated the 7-day week in creation and then sanctified the 7th day as a means of keeping track of the days of the week, while also being a continual reminder of creation and the Creator. So I just want to point out here the Hebrew for the word 7 is sheva, and the Hebrew for the word week is shavua. And you can see the connection there. They're the same root word with the shin bet ayin. So it's always good to understand how the Hebrew words fit together. So what is the significance of the number 7 in the Bible? We see a form of the number 7 491 times just in the Old Testament scriptures. The number 7 is associated with God, and it is used throughout the scriptures as a number of perfection and completion. Now, in the New Testament, the number 7 appears 88 times. However, one book in the New Testament contains the number 7 for a majority of these 88 times. The book of Revelation alone contains 55 times of the number 7. In my teaching series in the book of Revelation, I have one teaching that focuses on the number 7, which is titled John, Yeshua, and the number 7. If you're interested in viewing this teaching, you can simply go to the LeRaglai.com website, click on the Watch tab, and the Book of Revelation tab underneath that, and then go to Revelation chapters 1 to 5, and it's the second teaching, teaching number 2, and again, it's titled John, Yeshua, and the number 7. That's for those who want to have a more comprehensive teaching on the number 7. The spiritual and practical significance of the number 7 in the scriptures is established in Genesis 2, 1 to 3 at the end of creation week. This is the foundation for the number 7 in the Bible and in life as we know it. God blessed and sanctified the 7th day, and we continually live in the shadow of God's creation as we live out this pattern of the 7-day week. Was the 7th day observed as a holy day from creation until the time of Moses and the giving of the 10 Commandments? Did Adam and Eve continually keep the Sabbath day week after week? It's difficult to know in what manner and for how long the Sabbath was observed in humanity after Adam and Eve, especially after Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. By Noah's day, it was probably rare that humanity observed the 7th day as a Sabbath day because the people on earth were living wicked continually at that time. And it may be, in a sense, the reason that God destroyed humanity, because humanity had forgotten its creator. And that Sabbath day, that keeping of the weekly Sabbath day, the 7th day, was a one act of knowing and fearing God. So how did Noah and his family practice the Sabbath after the flood? Again, we don't read anything about the Sabbath in a specific way until Israel became a nation, which we will look at in a little bit. Now, although we don't see anything specific about the Sabbath day regarding Noah and his family, we do see the number 7 in the details of Noah's life and in the story of the flood. So I just want to point out a few of these applications or connections to the number 7. Number 1, Noah's father Lamech lived for 777 years. Seems to be the perfect number to live life for. Number 2, when God commanded Noah to receive the animals into the ark, he said that they were to come in by twos. However, for the clean animals, God said they were come into the ark in pairs of 7. Number 3, God gave Noah 7 days warning before the flood came. And you can look at that in Genesis 7, 4, and 10. And then number 4, Noah sent out a dove on 2 different occasions after the flood waters receded to see if they could leave the ark. And he waited for 7 days on 2 different occasions. Again, you can look at that in Genesis 8, verses 10 and 12. So that is some significance of the number 7 in connection to Noah and his family. But where do we read about the Sabbath in the scriptures outside of Genesis 2? Now, the Hebrew word for the Sabbath as a noun is Shabbat, and we only see this word for the first time in the scriptures in Exodus 16:23, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, the verb form of the Sabbath is first used in Genesis 2:1-3, which we've already looked at, and then in only one other place in the book of Genesis, and that's in Genesis 8:22, when we read of God's promise to not destroy the earth again as he did in the flood, and how the various cycles on earth will not cease. And so we don't need to look at that verse in particular because it's nothing to do with the seventh day or the Sabbath. Now, the next time we see this word Shabbat as a verb is in Exodus 5:5, when the Israelites were living as slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. When Moses and Aaron first attempted to talk with Pharaoh to let the people go and worship the Lord, we read Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5:5. Quote, "Again Pharaoh said, 'Look, the people of the land are now many, and you would have them cease from their labors?'" The use of Shabbat as a verb in this context is a powerful picture of exactly why God blessed and sanctified the seventh day, the Sabbath. In Egypt, the Israelites were living as slaves. According to Exodus 12:40, the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years. Now, exactly when they started being treated as slaves is difficult to calculate, but it was for a long time, and up to 350 years. That's according to after the death of Joseph, right? Because we read in the scriptures how there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and that's when the Israelites started to be treated as slaves. Now, there's no evidence of a Sabbath day or a day of rest in Egyptian culture. The ancient Egyptians lived according to a 30-day month with 3 sets of 10 days per month. Therefore, the Israelites would have worked day after day with no Sabbath rest for generations, for centuries, more than likely for about 3 centuries. God sent Moses and Aaron to set his people free from Egyptian bondage, but Pharaoh did not want the people to, quote unquote, cease from their labors. Pharaoh did not want to set them free from his control, and he would not even agree to allow them to have a day of rest, a Sabbath day, a day of ceasing from work. God showed his power in Egypt and set the Israelites free through his servants Moses and Aaron. Moses then led the Israelites through the sea and into the desert toward the promised land. The very first instructions that God gave to the Israelites in the desert as a free people were instructions regarding the collection of manna. As we read this in Exodus 16, verses 4 and 5, quote, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I will rain down from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, so that I may test them whether or not they will walk in my instruction. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily.'" Now, later in this same chapter, we read a dialogue between Moses and the Israelite leaders concerning these new instructions. So in Exodus 16:22-23, we read, quote, "Now on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, they said to them, this is what, then he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." That's Exodus 16:22-23. So this is the first time we see the word Shabbat as a noun in the scriptures. We see Shabbat twice in this one verse, Hebrews 16:23, where it reads, "Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh, Ladonai Machar." Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Now, sanctification of the 7th day as a holy day was communicated again here in Exodus chapter 16 after more than 2,000 years since the 7th day of creation. Humanity as a whole seemed to ignore the weekly Sabbath day since creation. Egyptian culture adopted a 10-day week without a day of rest, and Israel lived in that world system for 400 years. For a majority of those 400 years, they lived as slaves and were kept from experiencing a 7-day week or a weekly Sabbath day. Therefore, the very first thing that God instructed Israel as a free people was to keep the seventh day holy and observe the Sabbath day as a day of ceasing from their regular work. Observation of the seventh day as a Sabbath day was so important to the Lord that he not only prioritized it immediately after the Israelites came out of Egypt, but he also included it in the Ten Commandments as part of his covenant with the nation of Israel. As we read in Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11, quote, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male slave or your female slave, or your cattle or your resident who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. For that reason the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy." The weekly Sabbath day became an official commandment to be kept starting at Mount Sinai. However, the holiness and sanctity of the Sabbath began at creation, as God stated in the fourth commandment, as we just read in Exodus 20:11. Quote, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. For that reason the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy." The initial sanctification of the Sabbath occurred on the seventh day of creation, in God's perfect world before Adam and Eve sinned. The reinstitution of the Sabbath occurred in the desert 2 months before the giving of the law, when God gave the Israelites instructions about the collecting of manna in Exodus 16. The codifying of the Sabbath in the law as part of the Ten Commandments emphasizes how important the weekly Sabbath observance is to the Creator God. We also see how the Sabbath day is included in the appointed times as listed in Leviticus chapter 23. We read this in the first 3 verses. Quote, "The Lord spoke again to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these. For 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings." Now, in the remainder of Leviticus 23, we read about the various appointed times that God set up as holy days during the year, which Israel was to keep: Passover, the Feast of Shavuot weeks, which is also called Pentecost, right? You have the Feast of Trumpets, you have the Day of Atonement, and so forth. There are many different appointed times, but it was the Sabbath that is first. First and chief among the appointed times of the Lord is the Sabbath day. Why is the Sabbath first and chief of the appointed times of the Lord? And I think there's 3 clear reasons. Number 1, the Sabbath is the first historically. It occurred in creation week, right? The 7th day of creation. Number 2, the Sabbath is unique, being weekly. All of the other holy days, appointed times, are yearly, like Passover, it's once a year. Number 3, the Sabbath defines how a day of rest is to be observed. The Sabbath day is the standard for what it means to cease from work and from the busyness of life, to stop, to reflect, and to worship the Lord. For example, the Passover, it's a 7-day feast of the unleavened bread. You have a day of rest on the first day and the 7th day. And you need to understand what it means to have a day of rest in order to celebrate the Passover, right? So the Sabbath gives us that understanding of what it means to stop from work and to rest and to worship. By observing the weekly Sabbath day, we are simply living as our Creator showed us how to live. Work 6 days and rest 1. Keeping the weekly Sabbath day is a continual testimony to the world, proclaiming there is a God. He created the heavens and the earth. And number 3, God is to be honored as the Creator. Ignoring the weekly Sabbath day is a prideful act of self-reliance, causing men to forget their Creator. So I just want to give some concluding thoughts answering the question, what is the purpose of the 7th day? As we look back through history, it appears that the seventh day was forgotten or ignored from some time after creation until the days of Moses. We don't know exactly how it was lived out during those centuries. From the giving of the law at Mount Sinai in about 1450 BC up to the time of Messiah, the Sabbath day became worshipped as holy unto itself in Pharisaical Judaism. The Pharisees created so many rules for keeping the Sabbath day holy that it became a burden to endure rather than a day of rest to be enjoyed. We read about this in the New Testament, and we read about it in several different places. I'm going to be reading from Mark 2, 23 to 28, which says this, quote, "And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him.' Yeshua said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" That's Mark 2, 23 to 28. We see many examples like this in the New Testament scriptures where the Pharisees brought accusations against Yeshua and his disciples for not keeping the Sabbath according to rabbinic Judaism. Yeshua responded to the Pharisees by confronting their man-made laws, which choked out God's original intent for the Sabbath day. I believe it is still imperative to imitate our Creator by working 6 days and resting 1. By continuing to observe a weekly Sabbath day, we honor our Creator and live a healthy lifestyle as God ordained it from the beginning. In keeping with the teaching of our Messiah, it is good to remember his words in response to the Pharisees 2,000 years ago when he said, quote, "The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." That's Mark 2, 27 and 28. In Genesis 2, 1 to 3, we read that God ceased from his work, blessed the seventh day, and sanctified it as a holy day to rest and honor him. The seventh day, the Sabbath day, is a weekly opportunity to keep first things first, to cease from our labors, to remember our Creator, to enjoy the creation, to appreciate the relationships in our community, and to worship our Messiah as Lord. This is what I believe is the purpose of the seventh day. This is a conclusion to this teaching on Genesis 2, 1 to 3, answering the question, what is the purpose of the seventh day? It's beautiful to see how the scriptures come together. Here's some of the resources I use in my preparations. I want to encourage you to share this teaching with others. Also want to encourage you to give a donation of any amount to LeRaglai so that we can continue to make these teachings available to you and to others. You can go to our website, LeRaglai.com, and simply click on the Give tab. I also want to invite you to subscribe to our weekly teachings if you're not already subscribed. So you can either go to LeRaglai.com or simply scan the QR code on your screen and either click the Give or Subscribe tabs as needed. So thank you so much. God bless you and see you again next time.